You are told this story as if it were devotion, as if it were faith wrapped in incense and hymn. But if you listen closely beneath the poetry, beneath the ritual language, you can hear something else breathing. A system, calm, efficient, hungry. A system that did not need cruelty to survive, only obedience and time. Babylon did not fall because of this ritual. It thrived because of it. And that is the part history struggles to say out loud. Babylon was a city that understood power better than most civilizations that came before or after it. Power not only in armies and walls, but in belief, in repetition, in the quiet agreement that some things are simply how the world works. The Temple of Ishtar stood at the center of that understanding. Gold bright in the sun, cool and perfumed inside, a place where grain, silver, law, and worship blended into a single authority. To walk toward it was to walk toward certainty, not moral certainty, structural certainty. This is where the ritual begins, not with desire, not with pleasure, but with accounting. Names were written into clay long before bodies entered chambers. Payments were measured before hymns were sung. Roles were assigned with the same calm precision used to distribute rations or record harvests. What later generations would romanticize as mystery was, in practice, administration. And the women inside those walls were not myths. They were not symbols. They were people whose lives were organized around a purpose they did not design. They were called Kiddushtuaf and translated as holy women. The word sounds elevated, clean, chosen. But words are generous in ways systems are not. From the outside, the position looked protected. These women lived inside sacred walls. They were clothed, fed, trained. The law recognized them. Tablets granted them status distinct from wives and servants. To families facing hunger, debt, or instability, the temple offered security wrapped in divine language. It did not look like loss. It looked like order. Imagine entering the temple not as a prisoner dragged inside, but as someone guided there by expectation. You are taught the hymns. You learn how to move slowly, deliberately, how to lower your gaze without appearing fearful, how to hold silence in a way that feels composed rather than empty. No one threatens you. No one needs to. The structure does the work. Your time is not your own, but it is scheduled gently. Your body is not described as owned, only as dedicated. The distinction matters to the system, even if it changes nothing for you. A scribe presses your name into clay. That sounds soft. Final follows you longer than the chance. From that moment, you exist inside a ledger, and ledgers do not ask how you feel. Ancient writers like Herodotus describe these practices bluntly, almost carelessly. Modern scholars argue about translation, exaggeration, misunderstanding. Debate feels safer than certainty, but the tablets themselves are stubborn things. They list offerings, silver, grain, cloth, dates. They list names. They do not list consent. They do not list refusal. They do not list endings. What they show is not chaos, but routine. Men entered the temple not as conquerors, but as participants in a civic act. They paid. The payment mattered, not because it bought desire, but because it transformed the act into something unrefusable. Once the offering was made, tradition completed the rest. The exchange was never framed as indulgence. It was framed as contribution to the goddess, to the city, to stability itself. That framing is the most dangerous part, because when something is said to protect everyone, it becomes difficult for anyone inside it to say no. Inside the temple, life narrowed quietly. Days were structured around preparation, bathing, set, music, posture. Not to attract, but to maintain a standard. The women were trained to embody calm, to absorb expectation without resistance, to become surfaces upon which belief could rest without cracking. Some called this devotion. Others called it survival. The temple did not encourage individual identity. Names existed, but they faded. What mattered was continuity. The ritual had been performed before. It would be performed again. No single life was meant to interrupt that rhythm. At night, when the lamps burned low and the city outside softened into distant sound, the weight of that continuity became clear. This was not a temporary role. There was no path outward written into the system, no ceremony of release. The law was careful. It protected the temple's women from certain abuses. It acknowledged their status, but it never granted departure. A woman who cannot leave is not choosing to stay. Once a year, the structure revealed itself most clearly. The New Year festival approached with public celebration, processions, flowers, hymns that spoke of renewal and fertility. Outside the temple, people saw unity between heaven and earth. Inside, preparations were precise. This was the sacred marriage, a ritual meant to bind the city's future to divine favor. It was presented as cosmic necessity. The land depended on it. The harvest depended on it. Peace depended on it. And because so much depended on it, refusal was unthinkable. Those chosen for the inner role were not asked. They were informed. The language was certain, as old as the walls themselves. A sentence spoken so often it no longer sounded like a command. Tonight, you serve the goddess, not in spirit, in function. What happened in that chamber was not recorded in detail. That absence is intentional. The temple documented what it needed to justify itself, not what would expose its cost. Hymns survived. Symbols survived. But experience was left unmarked. What is certain is that those who passed through that threshold were never the same afterward. They were recognized differently, watched differently, marked in ways that could not be erased by time or silence. They had seen the heart of the system, and the system had confirmed its claim. After that, life inside the temple continued as before. That is the most unsettling part. There was no collapse. No guilt. No visible aftermath. The machinery did not pause. New names were added. Old names stopped appearing. Women vanished not through punishment, but through omission. Their mats folded. Their spaces filled. The ledger moved on. When questions were asked, answers came wrapped in reverence. To the goddess, a phrase that explained everything and nothing at once. This is how erasure works when it is normalized, not with fire, but with quiet efficiency, not with cruelty, but with procedure. The system did not hate these women. It simply did not need them forever. Modern discomfort with these rituals is often framed as moral progress. We like to believe we have outgrown such systems, that we would recognize exploitation if it stood before us wearing sacred language. But history is not distant because it is primitive. It is distant because it is familiar. Babylon did not invent the idea of sacrificing individuals for collective stability. It perfected the language that made it feel necessary. When later cultures encountered these records, they hesitated. Some denied them. Others softened them into metaphor. It was easier to call the rituals symbolic than to accept what it revealed about organized belief and power. Because if we accept it, we must also accept this, that systems do not need violence to consume people. They only need legitimacy. The temple is gone now. The ziggurat reduced to fragments. The hymns silenced. The ledgers broken and buried. But the pattern remains. Wherever a structure claims moral authority without accountability, wherever tradition replaces consent, wherever people are valued for function rather than voice, the shadow of Babylon lingers. The women inside Ishtar's walls were not monsters or saints. They were not temptresses or abstractions. They were lives arranged to serve an idea larger than themselves. History did not preserve their thoughts. It preserved their transactions. And that tells us everything we need to know about what mattered most. This story does not ask for outrage. Outrage fades too quickly. It asks for recognition. Recognition that sacred language has often been used to make exploitation orderly. Recognition that silence in the record is rarely accidental. Recognition that forgetting is sometimes an act of comfort, not ignorance. A name pressed into clay is easy to erase. A system justified by belief is much harder. And that is why this ritual was not simply abandoned. It was buried. Because remembering it forces us to look too closely at the line between devotion and ownership and to ask how often that line has been crossed, quietly, with approval. That is the echo Babylon leaves behind, not as myth, not as scandal, but as a warning written in absence.